Hi, thank you for joining this webinar. This is another great webinar from the London Branches 3 community, specifically North London branch, London Central branch, and London South branches. Now, we have another great event for you today, and this one is from our Innovation Hubs initiative, led by my colleague, Kate Marshall, who I'll hand over to in just a minute. It is AI-powered automation, the Mayflower Autonomous Ship. That's the title, and you may know that we had one previously on this subject. So this is very much an update on the Mayflower and its journey, its travels, its learnings so far. Now, if I just remind you that and I'm reading here from the IBM website, the maritime research vessel Mayflower Autonomous Ship, the first of its kind autonomous vessel, and IBM technology played a central role in bringing it to life. On its inaugural journey, the ship will commemorate the original Mayflower by following its transatlantic route. But this modern Mayflower will gather critical ocean data on the impact of climate change and pollution so that marine researchers can better understand and protect our oceans now and into the future. And it's more than just oceans, it's environment as well. And somebody who is instrumental in this is Brett and the Submergence group. But more about that later. IBM plays a key part in this, and the innovation leader, Andy Stanford-Clark, is with us today. But I want to hand over to my good colleague, Kate, who is leader of our Innovation Hubs initiative within the London Branches 3. Over to you, Kate Marshall.
Hello and welcome everyone to this evening's BCS Innovation Hubs event, where I'm absolutely delighted to say that we have some incredible, brilliant-minded innovators joining us to speak about the Mayflower Autonomous Ship story. I'm Kate Marshall, and I'm a member of the BCS North London Branches Committee and a leader of the Innovation Hubs initiative alongside my colleague Paul. Paul and I will be hosting you this evening. And just before we ask our speakers to introduce themselves, I'd just like to ask Paul to introduce himself first.
Thank you, Kate. Yes, so I'm a member of the BCS North London Branch Committee alongside Kate, and between the two of us, we have been running a series of webinars focusing mostly on innovations and innovation hubs. But in this particular webinar, we're looking at an innovative idea that has turned into a success, and quite how it's done it and what the consequences of that are some of the topics that we're hopefully going to be exploring throughout the presentation. So I will hand back to Kate in order to introduce our speakers and then get on with the main event.
Yeah, perfect. In fact, I'll just introduce the format for this evening, and then once Andy and Brett have introduced themselves, they can dive into the screen share and their story of the Mayflower. So the format of this evening's event will be, first of all, a short presentation from both Brett and Andy, who've joined us today. Following this presentation, that should take us to around about the top of the hour. And then we do have a couple of prepared questions just to kick off the question session for you all. But please do start posting your questions in the chat function whilst Andy and Brett are speaking, so that we can start to sort of order them, and we'll then start filtering through the audience questions, which will be our priority to cover. So please do get creative with your questions and have a think about what you'd like to know. It's a real pleasure and a luxury to have both Brett and Andy's time with us today. So please do make use of it, inviting you all to ask very complicated questions for our brilliant guest speakers today. So Brett, if I could ask you to go first, and then Andy, if you could introduce yourself after.
Sure. Hi, I'm Brett. gosh, I don't know what I do anymore. I'm the founder of the, I guess, the project director for the Mayflower Autonomous Ship project. My day job is designing and building submarines and unmanned underwater vehicle systems, and I run a small software company as well as a submarine building company. And we built the Mayflower for fun through our nonprofit foundation, and just to see if we could. So there, that's me.
Thanks, Brett. And I'm Andy Stanford-Clark. I'm an IBM Distinguished Engineer and Master Inventor. Long background in Internet of Things technologies, going back probably 25 years when I invented MQTT, or co-invented MQTT, if anybody's heard of that, which is the messaging protocol that is very widely used on the Internet of Things these days. So most of my career since then has been evangelizing the Internet of Things and helping create the market that we now know of as IoT. I'm a fellow of the BCS and a visiting professor at 3 UK universities. And I've been fortunate enough to be the IBM technology leader for the Mayflower project for the last 3 years. I've known Brett for a bit longer than that, and spend most of my time when I'm not doing my day job, living and breathing Mayflower related stuff.
And we use MQTT on Mayflower, believe it or not. So there you go.
Absolutely, you do. It shouldn't be too much of a shock to people, but yes.
Full circle. Nice.
Absolutely.
Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and then, yeah, but first of all, I'll tune into the story of the Mayflower. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks, Kate. Where is it there? I did a presentation the other day where I had 3 PowerPoints open on my other monitor, and I shared the wrong one. So people spent the first 5 minutes of my talk looking at a specification for some weird language I'm working on, until somebody kindly and tactfully pointed out that I wasn't actually talking about the thing I thought I was talking about. However, tonight we've got it right, and I am talking about the Mayflower Autonomous Ship. So this is a really cool 3D photogrammetry scan that we had made of the ship. And you can see it's 15 meters long, 6 meters wide, very low in the water. Got solar panels all over it to power it. And we're going to tell you a bit about what it is, how she works, how the AI captain makes her go along. And the main purpose of the ship is to be a platform for science experiments. And I'll tell you about some of the science experiments, and then the exciting mission of crossing the Atlantic, which was the primary goal of Mayflower for her maiden voyage that we completed. It's 2023 now, isn't it? Yeah, last year. I can only just started saying that. I don't know why this isn't changing. Oh, there we go. Right, so first I'll hand over to Brett for a bit of background on the project, how this weird and wacky project came to be.
Oh, thanks, Andy. Yeah, it really was. Well, how do I describe it? I tell people often that it was a hold my beer kind of thing, which is actually true. In 2016, I was meeting with some folks here in Plymouth. I live down in Plymouth in the UK, and where my other companies are. And we'd long been interested in autonomy and automation and autonomy, and building underwater vehicle systems that were autonomous, but not really long range. And we were meeting with the city about all sorts of, I can't even remember what it was about because it became about Mayflower. We were thinking about Mayflower 400, the 400th anniversary of the original ship crossing from Plymouth to Plymouth in September 1620. And so there was a lot of talk about building replica ships. And, well, I grew up in Massachusetts, not far from Plymouth. And I've been on the replica that was built in the United Kingdom in the late 50s and given as a gift to the people of the United States. And it's still there now. It's been refit. So the Mayflower 2 is there. And I didn't think that was a very good idea. And I politely said so, spoke my mind, which has often gotten me in trouble. And the result of my not being supportive of that endeavor was I was challenged with well, okay, smart guy, what do you want to do? And I said, well, I don't know, we should maybe build an autonomous ship that does it, something that speaks to the next 400 years of the maritime enterprise and not the last 400 years. Why don't we take this opportunity to, at least to some degree, invoke the risk that was undertaken by the Pilgrims back 400 years ago. And so for me, that's the most interesting thing about the original Mayflower crossing, which is every single person that got on that boat expected that they would either die on the voyage or die within the first year of landing in the new world. And they went anyway. And this included pregnant women, children. 2 women gave birth on the ship, one in the middle of the ocean and one when they dropped anchor in Plymouth in harbor in Massachusetts. So they understood the risks and they took them. It was worth it to them to begin something new. And I suppose we could debate the result of that, for better or for worse, but the risk interested me. And we miss that in the modern world in prototyping and risk taking. And I worry that my children grew up in a world that, where everything just works. You know, I grew up, when you go outside in the morning and get in your car and turn the key, you're surprised if it doesn't start. I guess I'm old enough. I grew up being surprised if it did. And so for me, I wanted to do something risky, and our risk at crossing autonomously an ocean with an AI-driven ship is infinitesimal when compared to what the Pilgrims undertook. So I shot my mouth off, and then we started. I said, you know what, I will hold my beer, and started designing ships. And then IBM came along and offered their kind assistance, and a marriage made in heaven was born. So there you go, Andy. That's my background.
Awesome. Thank you, Brett. So the grand plan was to set off on this transatlantic voyage on the 16th September 2020, which would be the exact 400th anniversary of the original Mayflower setting off. Unfortunately, due to COVID, things weren't quite ready. So we had the naming ceremony then anyway. Some very grand people stood on a landing dock and said kind words about Mayflower, and we broke a bottle of Plymouth gin over the side of her, and so she was named. Then it took a little while still to complete the construction and also the sea trials for that. So we actually ended up doing the first attempt in 2021, and then the second attempt, which was successful, in 2022. More of that later. Let's talk about the ship itself. Oh, let's talk about these facts, these folks first. So we've got Brett and we've got Don, who's the CTO of Marine AI, which is the subsidiary of MSubs. So the project was funded by the not-for-profit marine organization Promari. They chartered MSubs, Brett's company, to build the ship. They normally make submarines, so we had to persuade them to do one that would stay on top of the water this time. And then they've spun out Marine AI for this AI captain technology, which very deliberately, because it's not just for the Mayflower, this is very transferable technology to other types of ship, and it just happens to be trialed, to be pioneered in the Mayflower. So that was that. And IBM as the lead technology partner, many other companies and partners involved, academic and industrial, all sorts of technologies going into make a boat work. But IBM was the technology lead, and I'll explain some of the reasons why. Once you've decided to build an unmanned ship, form follows function, as Don Norman would say, and you get away. You don't have to have all the things that most ships do. So you don't have to have sleeping quarters, fresh water, a galley, food, toilets, storage space, headroom. All those things just go out the window, and you can dedicate the entire space to the purpose of the ship, which is as a platform for science experiments. The main purpose is to carry a set of payload experiments to help us further our understanding of climate change on the ocean, and also our pollution of the ocean, particularly microplastics. If you haven't heard of microplastics, they're not the big rafts of floating plastic bottles that we see on the David Attenborough films, but when those disintegrate, they become microscopic particles of plastic, which the plankton eat. Fish eat the plankton, we eat the fish, so we're eating the plastic that we dump into the ocean. Really bad news. However, we don't know much about the density of that microplastics through the entire transit across the Atlantic. So part of the experiment for an unmanned ship that can spend long amount of time at sea, far longer than a project with a boat with crew on, who of course it takes ages to get to the place where you're going to take the measurements. Then you might get a week or so doing that before everyone gets tired and bored and has to be paid and run out of food, and you have to go home again. An unmanned ship can stay out at sea for long periods of time, just doing really boring ploughing backwards and forwards, gathering data in places where people wouldn't want to go, and for long periods of time, so big longitudinal data sets. The AI captain that I've mentioned a few times is although it's called AI, actually it's an interesting blend of what we'd know as deep learning, prescriptive logic, so rules-based systems, and then a big optimizer, a big melting pot, which stirs at all the possible futures around and says, what's the next best action? So we'll talk about some of those things together. So the situational awareness that Mayflower has is generally gained from combination of cameras. There's 6 cameras, 2 at the front, 2 at the back, 1 each side. And we run IBM Maximo visual inspection software. This is image processing software. It's been trained on over 1 million images of things you might meet in the ocean. Things like everything from stand-up paddleboards to seagulls to icebergs, container ships in all orientations, a huge catalogue of stuff. Actually, seagulls was a really interesting one because they swoop into the camera, fill the image, and then swoop out again. So they don't actually cause a problem. But initially, AI Captain was shying away from every time it saw a seagull, which is made it look a bit scared. But we had to specifically tell it, don't be afraid of seagulls. What you can see in the camera is often very confusing. If you've got a camera that's moving from side to side, looking at boats that are moving from side to side, it's very easy to convince yourself that the image is full of, the sky is full of boats. So we use what we call sensor fusion to join together data from the radar and from AIS, which is the telemetry that most ships send out when they're at sea. And from that, we get a less ambiguous view of what's around the ship. And then the AI Captain puts zones of confidence around them. So it prefers going behind things rather than in front of them. And from that sort of plots a route of where it can go. Now, when you're at sea, you have to obey the rules of the road, same as you do the highway code when you're on the roads in whichever country you're driving in. And that's called COL regs, collision regulations. And that's a set of rules that you have to obey. And then there's an additional set of rules, which if you're wise, you will obey. So kind of sort of safe driving, instinctive. So roadcraft that you learn over years.
Anecdotal, experiential rules that we try to incorporate as well.
Absolutely, yeah. So rather than being like a teenager who's just been given the keys to the boat, it behaves more like a sort of seasoned captain. And that's called SOLAS, Safety of Life at Sea. And those rules have been encoded into an IBM product called Operational Decision Manager, which started off life in the financial services sector, actually, for doing rules-based decision logic. So if a customer's been this many times and they haven't got a credit overdraft and they want a loan and this and that, then do so and so. So the if this then that type rules. So those thousands of rules have all been encoded into this system. And the cool thing about them is it's not like lines of programming code. They're English-like sentences. So you can actually sit down with a naval captain and say, does this rule make sense? And you'll go, or she'll go, yeah, well, actually, you'd probably turn a bit further to the right now, so maybe 15 degrees rather than 10. And so you can kind of life cycle these rules as you go along. So the AI Captain hands its intended route over to the Operational Decision Manager, which then kind of keeps it honest by saying, no, you're not allowed to go in front of that ship. You've got to pass safely behind it. So you have to go over there, go behind the ship, and then go back to where you were going before. And then the AI Captain gets this updated route and then executes it. Now, the third element we've got is this optimizer, which is another IBM product called CPlex, which essentially takes all the possible future actions constrained by a whole load of parameters, like what's the weather doing, how much power we've got, how much is the sun shining, how much fuel is left, all these constraints, and then says what's the action we should take next to get us towards the next waypoint, and then from the next waypoint towards our destination. Now, I've mentioned weather a couple of times there. So IBM owns a company called the Weather Company, which is the data company behind the Weather Channel. Not many people know that, so it's an IBM company. So we have access to wonderful weather forecast data. In fact, we get 15-minute weather forecasts on a half-kilometer grid for the entire planet. So I've actually got a weather forecast for my house, which is continuously updated. Really interesting stuff. But we pre-process the weather forecast in the IBM cloud to determine what might be of interest to the AI Captain, then send that down over the satellite link so it can factor it into its equations. So it can sort of aim for the least bad weather systems as it plans its route. So that's kind of what it keeps doing. It does that over and over again until it gets to the next waypoint, and then over and over again until it gets to the final waypoint, which is its destination. And the interesting thing about this is that Mayflower is a self-directing autonomous ship. So you can give it a latitude, longitude, anywhere on the Earth, well, actually on the sea, anywhere in the ocean, and it'll go there. It's not affected by the tides or the way the wind's blowing. It'll fight against those things to get to where you've told it to go to. So there have been some well, non-self-directing autonomous ships that have claimed to have crossed the Atlantic, but they just kind of drifted with the tide and took months and months to get there, and eventually rocked up on some shore somewhere and then claimed success. So Mayflower actually went where we told it to go, which was pretty cool. And
it is, but my aspiration, sorry, Andy, I didn't mean to interrupt. My aspiration is that, when we go back to sea here later this year, we want to get to a point where it's interacting more with space-based assets and looking at the data provided by those assets about its, not just weather, but sort of hyperspectral imagery, et cetera, making decisions about things maybe with no place in particular to go other than just to explore. And so I'd like to get to a point, this is where I'll diverge from reality, where the ship can be sent to a region to collect data. And when it detects something anomalous, we'll understand that my humans are going to want to know about this. So I'm going to collect this data and I'm going to push it up to the satellite, or I'm going to offload some of it and process it here, process it in the cloud, and then provide information back to them. And it can decide based on a very broad, sort of loose set of rules that work in parallel with its navigation rules to sort of decide when to deviate and what to follow, and have access to the sort of corpus of knowledge we have all on our phone and be able to say, oh, this is really unusual. There shouldn't be this here. I'm going to follow this. And then report back that it's done that, as opposed to asking for permission. So that's, I think we're not far from that, a few years, actually.
Yeah, no, I really like the idea of higher level cognitive functions, which take in data from other internet sources. All the things you just been describing to an experiment itself might say, hey, this is really interesting. Can we go over there to look at this? And they might even put a bid in, sort of eBay style, to the AI captain saying, I'll give you 3 Bitcoin if you can go over there. And the other experiment might go, no, I'll give you 4 Bitcoin. So this is back when Bitcoin were actually not worth very much.
But I'll take it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So and then kind of that goes into the melting pot, and if the opportunity overrides the mission objectives, which is getting to the next waypoint, then it'll wander off over there and go explore. So all of this is eminently doable. So we talked a lot about these science experiments. We chose a set for the transatlantic crossing. Of course, they can be swapped in and out very easily. In the experimental bays that you can see marked along here, you can put the different experiments in. We've been working with a whole load of partners in mainly academia for various experiments. And we specifically focused on the chemistry of the ocean, which of course is changing because of climate change. And the impact of pollution. We're also very interested in marine mammals. So we had a whale song experiment. So as well as some of the more traditional sensors, we had a hydrophone, which was recording audio in the ocean to try and pick up if we had any whale songs. And I'll talk more about those in a moment. So we had this science pod, which is a suitcase full of electronics. In fact, it was a cluster of 4 Raspberry Pi 4s and a ton of disk. Which was actually coordinating all the experiments, telling them to run, sequencing some of their operations, then gathering the data back. The science pod was the bit that liaised with the AI captain to say, is it okay to run the experiments? It might be that for operational reasons, like there's not enough power, we need to shut down the experiments for a while so that we can focus on navigation. But most of the time, the experiments are just running free. We learned an awful lot about building things that go inside ships. All the experiments which worked really nicely on the workbench in the lab. In the top right, you can see one called Hypertaste, which is a project from IBM Zurich Research Lab, which is essentially an electronic tongue. So it has sensors for different types of ions, rather like our tongue does. And then we swish water through the system, through the Hypertaste system, and then it recognizes, thanks to a machine learning algorithm, which is trained on the relative speeds of saturation of the sensors, again, rather like our tongue, to recognize different chemicals. So in the same way as we don't have a sensor for orange juice, we have a bit of bitter, a bit of sweet, bit of sour. I go, "Ooh, yeah, I recognize that combination, that's orange juice." So hypertaste can detect different things. It all works superbly on the workbench, but you put it in a salty environment and shake it a lot, everything you can think of will fail, from plugs coming undone, wires coming out, solder, connections getting stripped, pipes getting bunged up, filters getting clogged. Everything that could happen happened. And of course, we don't have the luxury of somebody on board to reset it if that happens, or to clean it out. And this actually turned out to be one of the biggest problems, is that on a fully autonomous ship with no people on board, if something really minor goes wrong, something which on a normal ship you just get some gaffer tape out and wrap it around and carry on, or just tighten a screw or something, there's no one there to do that. Now, if you read sci-fi books like I do, then there's always some kind of robot for maintenance, or nanoparticles or something that can go and do repairs on the ship. R2-D2 is a mech droid that can go and fix things that are broken. We don't have a mech droid on board Mayflower yet. So unfortunately, if something goes wrong, even if it's the tiniest little thing, if it's a single point of failure, then that's game over. And that was the bane of our life, it turned out. And to comment on that, Brett? I think you're on mute.
No, you pretty much got it. It was the bane of our existence. So the most important thing in all this is, we tell people all the time, no matter how sophisticated your system is, it has to be reliable. If it's not reliable, it doesn't matter how much you spent on it, it's too expensive. So having redundancy is very important. And then of course you run into budget constraints. So it's a bit of dart throwing sometimes. What we found is that almost universally, whatever you think is going to break doesn't, and the thing you thought would never break does. And you would think that you could just figure that out and then do the opposite, like George Costanza from Seinfeld, but then also that doesn't work either. It's a Murphy's Law scenario all the time. So I'll leave you to it.
Absolutely. So this is a view inside the science bay. You can see that kind of box, silver box with blue bands around it in the bottom left. That's what we call our wet lab. So the sensors that are too delicate to stick on the outside of the boat and be subjected to the force of the ocean, we pull water in through a pump, swish it through there, and then pump it out again. And that gives us a chance to be a little bit more delicate with the use of the water. And there's various other experiments dotted around the boat as well. But you can see there isn't much room for people. Clearly, there aren't any people on board. It would be pretty unpleasant if you did get stuck on board with that thing throwing up and down around you. So it'd be pretty bad. We were getting telemetry from the boat as it went along. We have an Iridium satellite link, which we were able to use 400 kilobits. And that allowed us to bring some of the data off live. We did a degree of edge processing, so we're starting to get some initial insights, so interesting things rather than the raw data being sent out. Like, ooh, we think we spotted a whale. But also we were able to have live streaming webcams from 4 of the cameras for the whole journey, which is just absolutely amazing. Because although it's really nice to see what the AI captain is doing, we don't rely on having that. So the AI captain is fully responsible for the ship. It's not one of these sort of glorified remote control systems where there's somebody sitting in a bunker somewhere with a joystick or a Game Boy controller and some goggles on steering the ship remotely. It's fully autonomous. So it's what we call human on the loop. That means that the AI captain tells us what it has done rather than ask us for permission for what it's about to do. And now we can step in and correct it if we think it's wrong, but it's definitely the AI captain is the kind of the first responder and taking the calling the shots and making the moves. So we were getting this data streaming alongside we've got a lot of telemetry from the boat itself. So good thing the boat itself is a science experiment, because we didn't exactly know how the AI captain was going to behave. We didn't know how the different systems were going to react. So there's a ton of telemetry from the data from the boat itself alongside this data from the science experiments. And I don't understand what all these things are, but the fluorometer gives us things like turbidity and chlorophyll readings and phytoplankton readings, and there's temperatures and salinity and pH and all kinds of things, really interesting stuff. And the people who charted these experiments were absolutely desperate for this data. Now, this was only a subset of the data. The bulk of the data was stored on flash SSD cards in the science pod. for offloading after we got to the other side. So there's about, I think about 3 terabytes of data, which we eventually got hold of, the video and audio data, plus the very high resolution data we got from things like our accelerometers. So tons and tons of data there for the ship when it got to the other side. We had some pleasant encounters with dolphins. I really like this. This was one where dolphin was just hanging out with the ship. This was before we got the logos on the side. So this is quite early in the life of Mayflower. This dolphin was just hanging out with it for about 20 minutes, just going along with it, because it was very sleek through the water, very quiet, just a gentle hum from the motor, electric motor, and that was really nice to see. And on the transatlantic journey, we saw quite a lot of dolphins actually. This one, I think, was about 6 that you can pick out, which were again just swimming along with the ship for quite a long period of time. Really nice to see.
There turned out, I think we did a count, there were several hundred probably. It was quite a large pod. And sort of one of the things we realized after the fact is that we had stupidly not put a camera on the keel. So we're going to install forward and aft looking cameras on the keel now. So when we do get dolphins above water, there's it's just a foolish oversight. There's so much going on under the water that we really want to get data about it. The fact that we couldn't see it really drove us crazy. So we're going to fix that now.
Fantastic. That's great news. So the whale watching experiment is with the hydrophone. Was an interesting experiment. So we had a back catalogue of whale songs from a whale conservation charity in Hawaii. And so we had these recordings of whale songs. And so we built a temporal neural network, which would recognize if it saw something similar. And so the hypothesis is that the choruses of whale songs have similarities within the pod, and then the verses are unique to the particular whale. So we're rather hoping we would spot a whale and hear its song and be able to say which family it came from. However, there's an awful lot of data to be processed before we can get to that point, and probably several years of PhD students crawling through these sound files before we can get anything meaningful out of it. But that's the hypothesis that's being tested. And of course, you have to subtract out all the sound of the cavitation of the propeller and the hull noise and the generator noise when that's on.
Wind noise, wave noise.
Yeah, all those things.
All the other critters in the water. Yeah, all the shrimp clicking and all the other critters making noise. It's the ocean is, people I think have this tendency to think of it as quiet. It's quite a loud place to work, actually.
And if you subtract all those out, you might get left with the whale songs, if you're lucky, if you haven't accidentally filtered it out in the meantime. So this is a non-trivial exercise. So the plan was to go, as we've mentioned, from Plymouth, UK to Plymouth, Massachusetts, recreating the journey of the original Mayflower. And in April last year, I'll get it right eventually, we set off. We had to make a diversion to the Azores because there was a problem that needed fixing. So we headed down there, and having fixed the problem, which turned out to be quite easy to fix, the weather company advised that there was a big storm blowing through. So we waited for another week in the shelter of the harbour before we set out again. After day 27, 19 days at sea, we got to the halfway point. So we'd done 2,038 miles and another same distance to go. So that was quite a landmark. So we were quite pleased about that. And then eventually we ended up in Halifax, Nova Scotia, which wasn't entirely as expected because we were heading for Plymouth, Massachusetts. But we had a problem just around this point here with the navigation computer, which we actually lost one of the navigation computers, but luckily we had a spare and we didn't have to use a mech droid to switch it in, so we could switch over to it in software. But we thought it'd be prudent to head to the nearest land, which was about another 1,000 miles away, which was Plymouth, Nova Scotia. At that point, 40 days elapsed, 32 days at sea, 3,500 miles. We had actually crossed the Atlantic, but we were in the continent of North America, but not the country of North America. So we went to the United States of America, we're in Canada. So that wasn't quite a success. So, however, it was nice to be in Nova Scotia, and there was a marine conference going on at the time. So they were really thrilled to see this autonomous ship show up for their benefit, which is really nice. We've got some great photos of people crawling all over it. And then about a week later, we headed off the last 400 miles down to Plymouth, where Brett mentioned earlier Mayflower 2, which is, you can see in the background there. And this was the Associated Press money shot. You've got Brett sitting on the front of it there, tying it to a bollard. and Mayflower Autonomous Ship, Mayflower 400 alongside Mayflower 2, which is a really symbolic, very amazing moment, and huge popping of champagne corks all around. So 65 days elapsed from leaving Plymouth, UK, which turns out to be 1 day less than the original Mayflower took, in fact. 36 days at sea, because we'd spent time in the Azores and in Halifax. Nearly 4,000 miles. And there she was. So that was a huge achievement. And suddenly everyone's really interested because they, oh, you've actually done it. So the thing we're going to do, we'd actually done, which was just amazing to feel, an amazing feeling. So the question is, what's next? Well, as I mentioned, the AI Captain software is highly separable from the Mayflower ship. So we're talking to a lot of people in every aspect of shipping, from commercial shipping to military to research shipping, even private water taxis. How can we build autonomous ships based on this AI Captain technology? And there's a lot of interest, and it's spawned a lot of business as a consequence of that. Very, very interesting. What we'll probably see in the first instance, though, is not so much full autonomy for a ship. This is a very conservative industry, but perhaps an AI first officer. So alongside the human captain, there'll be a pair of AI eyes, constantly alert, never getting distracted, never getting tired. Oh, there's an iceberg over there, Captain. Oh, thanks God, I missed that. Oh, thanks. Perhaps something like 95% of the accidents at sea are caused by humans. So perhaps we could eliminate some of those.
Yeah, but I think it's important to point out that the vast majority of those accidents are not professional mariners. It's recreational boating. So we built it for research, and we are having a lot of discussions. Commercial organizations, there's about 36 vessels that use some version of the AI Captain that we developed now. But probably the best place for it would be in pleasure craft. So, you know, anybody can go and buy, if you have the money, anybody can go and buy a 40-foot yacht and drive it across Plymouth Sound at 30 knots and crash it into whatever they like with virtually no restrictions. You don't even have to be properly trained. And so we find that when the accident investigations are done, it usually starts with, well, we'd had a few beers that morning and we decided to take the boat out, ... And so an AI captain would be really useful in stopping that from happening, interceding, or at least keeping people aware. Anybody who spent time on the water with their family, with their children, with friends, it's very easy to get distracted. And well, AI systems don't get distracted. So we're thinking there might be some uptake there, but it's an interesting problem. As Andy said, it's a very conservative industry, even within the pleasure craft side of things. People seem more comfortable with automobiles being made autonomous than they do ships, which makes absolutely no sense to us, because by any rational risk profile, if you're going to do it, you want to do it on the water where everything happens slowly
and far apart, and you don't
far
get
apart, exactly,
running in front of you, and you don't have to
no
read
pedestrians,
60 miles an hour. Yeah, I'll tell you which one I prefer to do.
Exactly.
So meanwhile, it's all about the data. I mean, we've got various marine institutes now have got access to the data, analyzing it in various ways. We very consciously put the data, we made it public domain so people can access it if they want to. Contact me for details if you have a reason to want to play with the data. And you know, that's very much in the spirit of the funding organization Primari that wants to promote for the good of the ocean. Of course, our interest in sustainability and climate change and trying to reduce pollution, all this data is valuable. So, you know, look forward to finding some insights there. And finally, if you want to go to mas400.com, Mayflower Ship, that's the website. When she's out at sea, there's a live dashboard getting MQTT telemetry from the ship, and there's also all sorts of information about the project and the history and so on there. If you fancy a Mayflower t-shirt, we have a mass merch site. You can go to that URL there, or scan the QR code and buy yourself a t-shirt or a tote bag or something. And well, so now's the interesting bit. This is where the bit that Brett and I like the most. You know, we give this presentation so many times, but it's always the questions that are most interesting. And actually, we learn something from those. So
there's some really good ones too. I've just been looking.
I haven't been looking, but thank you for listening, and we look forward to spending the next half hour or so answering your questions.
No, thank you so much, Andy. That was absolutely brilliant, Andy and Brett, for joining us and telling that story. That's yeah, I mean, I've heard versions of it before, but that was absolutely fantastic. And we do have loads of questions in the chat panel, but please do keep sending them in as we're chatting, so we can cover as much as possible. In fact, Paul and I will cover the audience questions first, then if we run out, we'll come to the prepared ones, because I would like to prioritize the time we have for the questions coming in from our live audience. I know, Brett, that you've answered this sort of in a short sentence on the side already, but I'll go for the first question that just does come up in case Andy would like to comment on that as well. But Mal Young has asked, how does one get into a career in maritime AI? She's asking particularly in the case of her daughter. But
just call, we're hiring. I wish I'm not being silly. We are actually desperate. I think it's such a big question when you say, how do I get into a career in AI? It's vast now, and we're only at the beginning of the opportunity. We struggle hard to find people that want to do this sort of work. There's a lot of people, great mathematicians, and people who get into coding and machine learning systems go off into financial tech. It's a lot of money to be made. There's a lot of interesting stuff in government service and environmental work. It's everywhere. I think if you are a graduate from any reasonably reputable university, or maybe not, and you're a good mathematician with solid coding skills, you're going to get a job, or a physicist with good coding skills that has good math. And gosh, I mean, there's so many jobs in AI and machine learning. It's just never ending, and it's growing every day. I don't know what you think, Andy, but I mean, they're the big companies, but gosh, there's a national AI strategy for the UK. You can go on there and look at, there's various catapults and conferences and job fairs, and every single employer is desperate, literally desperate to hire people with skill.
And you could say this is applied AI. I mean, so if you've got AI skills, applying it to, sweeping generalization, you can apply it to any particular domain, but you need the domain expertise. But putting people alongside people with mariners and sort of people who build ships for a living means that somebody with AI skills can rapidly, very transferable skills.
Yep.
So it's, we've probably talked enough about that one, but that was the get into computers and AI is a good policy.
Get a LinkedIn page and post your resume and looking for a job in AI, and you'll never stop reading this. It's not hard these days.
There's a question about having mech droids.
We actually looked at this quite a bit. It's not sexy though, and one of the things that people don't think about is that those also break. So at some point, at some point, you have a Russian doll effect of ever smaller robots that have to fix robots. But what we found is it really depends on what your mission set is and what risks you're willing to tolerate. But we've been looking at automobile assembly robots are really excellent things for this. So, but developing the standardized tooling heads and the diagnostics, it's very challenging. You're really going to need a person to do it. But we looked at and worked with several of the companies. Phaneuf is one, and Festo does some really fascinating things in Germany as well. But they're also very power hungry, and they tend to be rather large. So you end up constrained in a lot of ways that make it very challenging to deploy one. And again, those also break. So I think as the ships get bigger, there's a couple of companies, one in the UK that's building 78-meter minimally manned vessels that have an AI bridge, although they're manned, but they're going to go to an autonomous or remotely operated version. I would not be surprised to see that happen, but the ships tend to be really complex spaces, and as they remove the people space, you remove the space for the robots. You have to design in robot space for repair. Right. And I'll give you an example of why that doesn't always work. On the first try to cross, we had a failure in a seal, and guess where the only thing was that we couldn't see with the internal cameras? The part that broke, right? We couldn't see it. We could see all around it, but we couldn't see what was actually happening. And we had to deduce it from experience. But yeah, it's very challenging. And the diagnostic end of this is like, that's yet another end of, failure modes effect and analysis working. I mean, that's a huge area of research within the navies, right? And within, because they're the ones who are spending all the money, and space systems, actually, probably space systems are the most advanced. You have to think, you know, Voyager is still running and it's 40 years old, it's outside the solar system. And that's actually a very sophisticated computer for something that old. And NASA developed a very early, well, I digress. Anyway, lots of money being spent on these sorts of questions within the navies. And, you know, how do we make these ships reliable and robust? And how much space do you give over to repair? And how do you do predictive analytics to know what's going to break and what you should have on the ship and what you should have two of that work in parallel? It's a big area. That's yet another area of work for people who get into that. And IBM makes a tool for that too, right, Andy? Maximo.
Absolutely. Maximo, yes. Yep.
They make a software
That's
tool to help with. Yeah.
No, thank you for that. Just to cover a couple more of the questions, because we've got really quite a few coming in the chat. Paul, do you want to pick one of the audience questions to look at next?
Oh, they're so good. These are all good.
Yeah, so relating to the safety aspects, there's a question saying, you mentioned SOLAS. How would Mayflower react to Mayday or Pan-Pan,
Well,
either the VHF channel 16 or GMDSS?
Right, so that's a really good question. Not well, I guess, would be the actual answer. So we have a VHF.
Well, hang on, so there is the point of the requirements for an autonomous ship, which are just that you report it as soon as reasonably possible.
Yeah, but the reality is there's no law on this. So the truth is that there's no legislation on the development of unmanned vessels, right? The governments are trying to play catch up, as they did with aerial vehicles. But there's no international consensus on any of this. There's no consensus within the UK. It's quite fraught, actually, at the moment, quite heated tempers, of which I'm one. But I
imagine.
Yeah, well, the SOLAS thing in particular is an interesting problem. Often that's used by the Maritime Coast Guard Agency to try to prevent us from operating unmanned vessels. And so, well, if you can't respond to SOLAS in a way that a manned vessel would, you can't go to sea. And I'm like, oh, okay, so, but not all manned vessels respond to all incidents and all emergencies, right? Because it's not a stupid doctrine, right? It's a do no harm kind of perspective. You don't send an oil tanker if it's an inappropriate vessel, and you don't send a rowboat, right? If you need a different vessel. It's about what is the emergency, what aid can I render, and I guess from a pragmatic perspective, if we detected which we did, by the way, I'll tell you about that. If the Mayflower rolls up on a sinking vessel and we're 1,000 miles offshore and the people are floating in the sea or in their life raft, and Mayflower comes over and we hail them through our loud hailer and we say, hey, would you like to get on the ship? At least you can plug in, you can get power, maybe we can tow your raft, we can, there's other things we could do. You could call somebody. If they turn their nose up and say, no, we're going to wait for a ship that's properly equipped as a manned vessel that can provide, succor in the way we deserve, then, well, I guess that's their choice. That won't happen. But there's a lack of pragmatism within the regulatory framework to think about these things. They're not a manned vessel that happens to not have people on. They're designed from inception with nobody to be there. And so they don't have food, and they don't have water, and they don't have life rafts. And we get into this debate a lot with regulators. They say, well, why don't you have a life raft? So, well, there's nobody on it. And they say, well, what if another vessel sinks and you have to render assistance? I said, well, they should be in their life raft.
Exactly. Good point. Well,
why am I responsible for them?
Yeah, quite.
I'll help them if I can, but they have to, just because they fail to meet their obligations doesn't mean everybody else has to. And so it's a really good way to stifle innovation and creativity. But we actually did detect when we were cruising from Nova Scotia to Plymouth, we got on radar, actually, a blast from a radar that there was a ship in distress, an emergency beacon, and we called the Coast Guard immediately, and they didn't have anything. They got nothing. And we said, well, what do you want us to do? There's clearly, we're an unmanned vessel. We can't do anything other than put eyes on it. It'll take us about an hour to get there. What do you want us to do? We'll divert now. And they instructed us not to divert because they thought it was more risky. And they said, we don't have anything on EPIRB. We don't have anything on 16. We don't want you to divert. just carry on your heading under your orders, because we had op orders that the U.S. Coast Guard issued us. So, you know, it's a mixed bag. There's no consensus. It varies wildly from country to country.
Yeah, really interesting.
Yep, and that's part of what's interesting about Mayflower. I often tell people, sometimes I think about it as a thumbtack, right? There's all this sort of intellectual debate about what should it do, what should ships like this, how should we regulate it. In fact, we had actually a regulator tell us that we shouldn't be allowed to operate until they could consider and wholly publish a corpus of regulation prior to us innovating. And I said, oh boy, that sounds like a great recipe for a very poor future. You have to be able to perceive all the possible ways that some technology might emerge so that you can put regulations in place prior to its development. Genius. Yeah, so
well, let's move on.
Yep, sorry.
Yeah. Well, around that point about what the Mayflower should and perhaps could do, we've got one question around whether the Mayflower could be used for targeted nature surveys. So, for example, could we find out where blue whales birth and nurse their young, for example? So, more specific about.
Sure, I hadn't thought about blue whales in specific, but I've been thinking about going to the Sea of Cortez on vacation. So, if that's a mission that lovely person who posed the question would like to help us with, and yeah, hey, let's go look. Sure, it can do all sorts of things. That's a bit of a vast mission. Find where blue whales give birth. You know, that's probably a pretty good way to spend some time. But of course, you'll find lots of other things on the way. So
there's a proposal to have the Mayflower track tagged sea animals and then go sample the water around where they are, so you effectively get to sample the living environment of those animals.
No, we're doing that in June. We're working with Woods Hole Oceanographic, and so they have a seafloor installation on the continental shelf in about 1,000 meters of water, and it looks up acoustically and looks at the biomass, what's swimming around it. And particularly, it's where there are these things called warm core eddies that spin off the Gulf Stream and counter-rotate and sort of go backwards down the East Coast. And they bring warm water or warmer water. And then you get all these predatory fish. You know, you get sharks and tuna, and you get cetaceans and all these other things. And they kind of are in there. And then you're looking at the vertical migration throughout the diurnal vertical migration of biomass, phytoplankton, zooplankton from depth to the surface and down again over and over again in those areas. You're looking at how all this works. And so we're going to send the Mayflower out there, collect data, and talk to the mooring on the seafloor and pick up data, get some information, give us a connection out to the ocean. And then at the same time, there's thousands of tagged predatory fish, and we're making an algorithm that'll sort of synthesize areas of interest with these large fish that are interacting with prey species in the warm core eddies. And then that will just automatically feed rough course, sort of large target areas where the Mayflower should go cruise around and sample. And that'll just happen all by itself. So we'll be doing that later this year in June.
Cool. I'm going to jump to a question which has a thread back to a previous question in the answers that you gave. Rather than being about safety, did the team consider piracy, given the cost, the value of the equipment, and obviously the fact that you're broadcasting where the ship is and what it's doing?
Yeah, we can ask
favorite question from journalists, this one. You always ask about pirates.
Always, yeah. So we get asked that a lot. And the answer is I didn't really worry about it, because not a lot of piracy in the North Sea and North Atlantic. If we were east coast of Africa, west coast of Africa, around the Niger River Basin, South China Sea, a few other places, problematic, right? Absolutely. And Mayflower's not fast. She's built for long-range cruising. And I guess for me, if somebody wanted to spend the time and the money to go out and pick her up and tow her somewhere, I mean, we're going to know. There's a lot of redundancy.
We know to 5 decimal places where it was.
We know exactly where it is and where it's going, and we're going to know exactly where it turns up. And it's not like you can get in it. It's not like, every Nazi submarine has a cache of gold in it. It's not like, right, we didn't put gold bars in it. So if you wanted to go,
I'd be disappointed.
Yeah, if you want to go get it, I suppose you could, but
there's no crew to hold to ransom. There's no.
And the reality is, it probably cost you as much probably more to go and get it than it would be, when you go and get a ship like that to go out and capture something, it's $40,000-$50,000 a day,
Yeah.
right? So they probably spend more to get it. And then we'd know, right? We'd see them coming, we'd hail them, we'd talk to them, they'd lie to us, they'd come over, and at some point we'd press the delete button, and that would be that, right? Wipe all the drives, so they'd have nothing. They'd have the vessel, but then there's a whole bunch of other ways we could track them down and get them. But no, we didn't worry too much about it.
No.
No, very good response. I've got a very specific question from Carol asking, how does the Mayflower actually navigate into the port?
Oh, that's a good one. Well,
Good.
so it's kind of a nice symmetry. The further you get away from land, the lower the bandwidth your communications with the vessel, which is great because there's less and less stuff out there to run into. And the stuff that is out there is really predictable. The biggest challenge is the ocean itself. As you get closer to shore and the population density, so to speak, increases, you also get better comms, generally speaking, get 4G, get whatever else. And so the system manages its communications profile very well. And so it'll switch over to the highest bandwidth available connectivity, and we'll be able to real time see it, but we can also intercede. So generally in extremely congested areas, we'll either meet the vessel, and this varies state to state, but in England, we were required to tow it. We had to tow it out from 12. We could work within the harbors in what are called categorized waters, and then we had to tow it to 12 miles and let it go. We couldn't have it not on a leash physically. Fine. In the US, they didn't care about that. They just wanted a boat to be with it. But now they've kind of relaxed about that too, because we've been so successful and safe. And they're like, well, this is probably okay, as long as you have greater than something like 95% uptime in your comms. And we do, even with the Iridium system. It's been remarkably stable, really impressive, actually. And then, so it tends to be more interactive with people. So you tend to spend a lot of time watching it, and we can intercede and drive it around like a go-kart if we want. And sometimes you have to. And then once the personnel are on site with either the escort vessel or the tow vessel, we just relinquish control to the local vessel, and it just follows them. Literally put it in a following mode, and it just follows the support vessel home. And you have Andy made fun of it, but it's true. We have an Xbox controller on the back deck, and it just follows you. And then when you want to dock it, you just hit a button and you just with your thumbs and Xbox it right onto the pier and then tie it up. That's how we do it.
That's brilliant.
Great question, Carol. Thank you.
And slightly related to that, from Esther asking, could you share a bit about your experience with integrating sonar on the Mayflower?
Well, we didn't integrate a lot on there. We didn't have an ADCP, which I wish we had, acoustic current Doppler profiler. And we're installing that and what's called an EK80 bioacoustic sonar system with Woods Hole now. We're not sure how well that's going to work, because we probably want to get deeper in the water. So we had to build a false keel that we're installing, we're welding to the hull to get the sonars away from the aerated zone around the hull itself near the surface, because it's quite a shallow draft vessel. The hydrophone suffered from this as well, so it's being relocated as deep as we can get it on the new keel. We didn't do any imaging sonar. We had a depth sounder, which is fairly simple, just one you'd find on any vessel. We didn't do a big full ocean depth one. I think the biggest issue is really we couldn't get very deep in the water with the current keel design. So we designed a new keel with Woods Hole, and that's being welded on, and that'll give us a bit better performance. And we're adding a significant number of sonars. So the biggest issue we have now is really probably data storage for their bioacoustic sonar, and power is no problem. We have plenty of power. And then I think we're going to have to do a little bit of, we'll have to get clever on sync pulses, syncing pulses so we don't walk all over the sonars. Although the bioacoustic one is, for those acousticians, CTFM system. So it can be challenging. Some of them will have to be run at different times for different experiments so they don't talk over each other and wipe out their own data sets. Does that help? How's that?
Yeah, no.
Just in terms of extremes as well, we've got a couple of questions that are related to this. One is that the maximum sea state that the Mayflower could handle. another one about problems of extreme temperature, in this case icing over, but I guess the opposite is true as well, extreme heat.
Heat was a bigger problem for us. You know, fortunately, the ocean at the times that we went, and the North Atlantic in general, is cold by comparison to the vessel's internals. Heat dissipation will be probably a biggest challenge as we go forward with this kind of thing, because it's quite a small space. And that we're really aggressively, we're actually designing a new cooling system for the boat now to get away from raw water cooling, and we're going to these really beautiful custom built keel cooling systems and ventilation systems. But the latter presents another problem, because we did encounter some pretty serious sea states, which is why we had to divert the second time, because we got pasted in a really tough storm. And so what turned out to be the problem was we were losing assets, parts of the systems were shutting down. So we surmised, at least I did, that we had a ground fault. And you know, the young engineers are funny, you know, they're AI guys, they're not boat guys. They say, oh, boats don't just develop ground faults spontaneously. It's like, oh, welcome to the world of boats, right? That's like all they do. So that cost money. It's their favorite thing next to sinking is getting a ground fault. And so it's true. And so, you know, what happened when we inspected it is that the storm was so violent at one point, you know, we had a cable bundle break free and rub itself against an internal stiffening frame of the vessel's hull and wear through and ground, and that shut down a whole series of computers. But we had enough redundancy that we could, through the SATCOM system, direct the compute resource to redeploy containerized software in different areas of the ship. And it got down to a pretty ugly Jenga stack. By the time we got to Halifax, we were one Jenga piece away from a bad result. So the turning into Halifax was a good idea. But at least 2 occasions where the entire vessel was completely submerged. So we were driving forward into a head-on storm. Waves were, I think, the largest 6-7 meters. We had some really high chop, like 3-meter stuff, but really short period. And we were pushing into it with everything the boat had, and she was only going a knot, 1 knot.
Yeah, there's long periods of time when she was just going along at 1 knot. I've got a little speed sensor here.
Yeah, and she had like 80 knot winds on the nose, right, with ridiculous sea states. And we had several occasions where the topmast camera's about 6 meters off the water, and we watched that go underwater as a big wave came in and we went through it. So yeah, we're good at submarines, so that paid off. But yeah, we had at least 2 occasions where she was fully submerged. The biggest issue with sea state is she doesn't care about that stuff. She's tough, but the biggest issue was the hull form we chose isn't self-righting. So if we got her a beam, so she has to be quite careful about her attitude relative to the wave set and the wind. So she has to think about, well, I kind of want to go this way, but this is what the waves are doing and the wind is doing, and I might not be able to do that. Or even if I can, it might be better to have it take 500 miles longer to get there. Because if I get into, you know, a beam sea, I could end up upside down, and that'll be the end of it.
It's game over.
Yeah. And many, to be honest with you, no one believes me, but I often wish that at some point as we got to the end of it, you see this 100-foot wall of water come and just smite us, right? At least then I could move on to something.
Gosh, in style.
I could build another vessel to go and find out what happened to that one. You got to have something to do. So anyway, sorry, I'm rambling.
Not at all. We've hit 7:30, so I'm going to try and wind it up there, if I may. I'd just like to thank you, Brett and Andy, so much for sharing the project and everything you know about the project. I would like also just to mention one thing, because Andy, you said about the data previously, and there is a comment here. Paul has said, I'm a lecturer teaching T-level students, and the curriculum focuses on coding and data. Are there any opportunities to educate the students on your project or to use your data for educational purposes?
Sure.
Perhaps when the BCS publishes this video, we could add some links maybe to
that's a
to
brilliant
you or
idea.
to where the data is
Yeah.
available
If
for
you want to get in
consecutive.
touch with me in the first instance, we're happy to discuss. Paul?
Super, thank you.
Perfect.
And yes, just to say thank you so much for sharing it with us. It's extremely interesting, exciting. I can't wait to see what happens next. Of course, people can go and view the website to see where you are and how things are developing. And thank you everybody for attending. We've had a remarkable attendance. So hopefully people have come to this, learned a lot more than they knew before, and gone away with an enthusiasm to innovate in areas without permission and to see what happens.
Very important.
Yes.
Nicely put.
And
Yes,
on
thank
that
you
note,
all for your very interesting questions as well. That's the brilliant discussion that we've had after. Thank you all.
indeed.
Thank you.
Absolute pleasure. And as always, we love all those questions. That's the most interesting part for us.
Thank you very
thank you
much.
so much, Brett and Andy, for joining us. That was absolutely fantastic. See you all